Classroom a few times. All right, this is going to be fun. Woo. Largely because for who? Them. Well, largely because Paul and I have known one another for putting on about 40 years now.
Yeah.
Which is a frightening number. And this is a rare opportunity where we're both on the same panel together, and it's just us. And rather than talk about what's in the next issue of Legion, which I will let Paul do at the end of the panel, I think it would be great, since one of the things that sets the show apart from so many others is that this is a celebration of comic books themselves and the creators and the history, is go all the way back and start down memory lane. And I want to start with asking you, in the early 60s, you have always identified JLA 2122, the first Crisis crossover, as the thing that pulled you in. So talk about what that appeal was.
Well, I think it was the first comic I bought on the newsstand. I had read other people's comics. The older kid up the block always had a box of comics in the garage in my generation. And Lester had this big decaying box of Batman versus Dr. No-Face and the False Face Society and the Faceless Creature from Saturn and Strange Adventures. I guess he had a face fixation at the newsstand. I'm not sure why. Or that's what attracted me out of the pile. But I remember being on the main street of Monticello, New York, one of the summers away up in the Catskills, and still remember which newsstand it was, had an outdoor rack, and picking up, I'm pretty sure it was JLA 2021, not 22, and then it being years and years till I got to read the second part of that. I think it was the many characters. I mean, given my writing career, it's not hard to identify me as a sucker for super teams. But Legion was my early favorite strip. Avengers, out of the Marvel stuff some years later, where I learned an awful lot of my writing style from Roy's channeling of Stan. The team books always had a special magic for me. Either it was more stuff, or it was, in fact, that more things could happen in them later on.
Well, growing up in Brooklyn, what was it that led you to go from a casual reader to a collector?
I think probably the decisive moment in becoming a collector is when, I think at my mother's behest, I like blaming my mother. She's passed away now, so she can't defend herself anymore. I swapped a Superman comic for something else to one of the older kids on the block. It was the issue where he finally went to Kandor, and he sort of had the masked villains of Kandor escaping, blaming Superman, the one that had the first Nightwing and Flamebird in it. And I remember being so angry or disappointed or hurt that I didn't have that comic anymore. Somehow or other we had to organize getting them traded back. I think that was the last comic that left my clutches without me screaming or volunteering. The rest of my life was just persuading my father to build more shelves.
And at that point, were you just DC, or were you collecting the Gold Key and the Marvel, the Charlton? I mean, what were your parameters?
Well, I was only allowed to buy 3 new comics a week. Mom wanted to keep the habit under control. Didn't work out so well. So I was pretty much exclusively DC till the week that I was graduating public school. When Dad took the week off, he was the president of the PTA, so he had to do various ceremonial nonsenses. And one of the wonderful things he did in the course of my life was bend some of Mom's rules, and he really didn't mind if I bought a few extra that week. So that's when I finally started to get into the Marvels a little bit more.
And you know, that must have been Stan's storytelling and art style that was being published was so different than the DC stuff. Was it like a culture shock for you?
I'd read a few Marvels in other people's collections, and gotten into debates with kids on the block who were arguably wiser than I was. My friend Alan was a big proponent of Fantastic Four. That was his favorite comic, and he'd gotten a subscription to it. Looking at it as a mature professional or adult, or as close as I come to either of those two things, I think he was probably more right than I was about the quality of the stuff. But I had not yet gotten addicted to that particular flavor. I was still very happily enmeshed in Mort Weisinger's Superman books and Julie Schwartz's superhero books as my two favorite flavors. I don't remember particularly being shocked by the Marvels at that point, but it was a really good time to come into Marvel because this is right as they were beginning to increase the number of their titles and really explode out.
Mm-hmm. And what about the other DC flavors? I mean, the War books or any of the Altanoff and cashed-in titles?
I never was able to buy enough titles to really go that far afield. I, again, would occasionally read them in other people's piles, but that's a case where, looking back, I think I had the right taste. I mean, I enjoy working with Murray and George, both good human beings. Bob Kanigher certainly did some extraordinary work in those years in the war books. Brilliant writer I got to work with as an editor for quite a number of years. But the best stuff was the superhero stuff. Okay, and as you're reading and now collecting all this stuff, did it ever occur to you there were career opportunities? No, I didn't really have any sense that human beings actually did this. I grew up in a working class neighborhood. The only professionals at anything that I had ever met were my doctors. There weren't people who had office jobs. I think there was one insurance salesman somewhere on the block. This was bus drivers and exterminators, and my dad was the chief clerk of an industrial hardware place. His friends were carpenters. You did things, you made things, you worked on it. As a little kid, the universe that there were jobs like I've spent my life doing were unimaginable to me. Okay. So at what point did you go from collector to fan? When did you find comics fandom? Kind of a race between Mark Hannerfeld's bullpen pages and the VC books, which started talking a little bit about fandom. So that's about 1968. Yeah. Yeah, okay. 67, 68. And one of my friends at one of the bungalow colonies managed to get a copy of Mark's On the Drawing Board / The Comic Reader. And that was, I think, the first fanzine I ever saw. I remember creating my own carbon paper typed fanzines based on things cribbed from there or otherwise accumulated at about age 10 or 11, I suppose. So did you then begin buying other fanzines and plugging into that growing fan network? A little bit. It was a several-year evolution. You don't have a lot of money at 11 or 12. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of comics themselves to buy. And I know back then, obviously, before there were a lot of conventions, and certainly before mass communication was, affordable to young kids. I mean, it was correspondence. So it was people like Roy Thomas writing to Jerry Bales and stuff. Right. Were you writing to people and starting to correspond? Not yet. I mean, really, the tripwire for all of it was through the fanzines. And when Don and Maggie Thompson announced that they were going to stop doing Newfangles, which was the closest thing to a real newszine at the time, they announced it a year in advance because they were a young married couple and they actually had a life. Very odd thing for fans. And they didn't want to go to all the trouble of returning the money, so they said, well, you can send in this many cents for the rest of the issues this year, and that number would change every issue. So they could sort of wind down neatly. Paul Kuppenberg and I were sitting around my living room, hanging out, and we're not going to know what's going on. We scraped together $16 and started a fanzine, sent it off the few places we could identify to have it reviewed. Don and Maggie were kind enough to say some kind words about it, foolish enough to say it, Pat. And that's really what connected me into the Wired world. So how did you inherit the comic reader? I think just by showing up and doing it, sort of fit Woody Allen's 90% of life is showing up rule. So Mark Hannerfeld was giving it up? Mark had stopped publishing probably about 2 years before, to all intents and purposes. And he was doing some assistant editor work at DC. I knew him from that, from doing Etc. And I managed to put out, I guess, about 6 or 7 issues of Etc. in a row. PK had dropped out of it for a while. And Mark just comes up to me one day with this big manila envelope of nickels and dimes and index cards and says, here, I'm not getting this done, why don't you take it over? And suddenly my subscription base went from, I don't know, 200 or 300 to about 1,000 in a minute. And suddenly I was the newsine of the field. At 14.
As Newsfangles wound down, Paul's comic reader became the TV guide, the influential news and listings source for everything coming from the major publishers, including a little bit of Charlton and Goldkey news and some Warren news, but it's predominantly DC Marvel.
Well, the hardest thing for, I think, the current generation of fans, and I mean, this is a room of people who aren't 12 years old or 15 years old. Most of you have been around a while, but even I think for many of you, the publishers didn't want to give out the information to anybody in those days. They didn't think fans. I remember Marvel at one point deciding they weren't going to give me any information because it wasn't fair for fans to know before the readers. But also they weren't telling the talent. The writers and artists didn't know when their books were coming out, or when their stories in an anthology book would come out. So it was disproportionately important information to people at that time because it was the only way you could find out what was coming out. And if you went into an ordinary newsstand, it was kind of potluck. You know, the one on the corner would have these 6 titles, but the one down the block would have 3 others. So even as a writer doing comics, you didn't know how to get copies of your own stories. And suddenly, the information I was providing enabled you to collect your own stories.
Where you lived, how many different places did you have to hit to get what you needed or wanted?
To some extent, it was infinite. You know, I usually went to about 4 or 5 comic shops, 4 or 5 shops that sold comics. Newsstands, delis, but you never knew. I remember vividly finding Savage Tales by surprise in a newsstand that I didn't usually shop for stuff, and in a rack where I wouldn't usually look.
Yeah, growing up on Long Island, my best friend and I would have to make a circuit of 3 different places, literally crossing town lines. So we wound up in 3 different towns at newsstands looking for the books we wanted.
Yeah.
But we finally figured out Tuesdays and Thursdays were when the new books came out. Yeah. Now, the comic reader finally started getting the support of the publishers. Was it through personality, into perseverance? I mean, how did
Sure wasn't personality. I mean, I have no idea why in hell they put up with me. You know, looking back, it astounded me that a 14-year-old kid was allowed to hang around the offices in those ways. And just sadly, I think in my years as publisher, I don't think I would have thrown anyone out, but I don't think I was running an office that would have been hospitable to that happening again. Some of that was just the world had gotten larger and more corporate. But something, it was a really strange moment to have gotten away with all of that. The writers and artists' support, I think, probably mattered tremendously in that process because they really appreciated getting that information and that news, and the fact that they liked what I was doing helped open the doors.
And how did you leap from the fanzines to the conventions? When did you first attend one?
Well, I wasn't able to go to the conventions before I was doing the fanzines because we went up to the Catskills for the summer, and we usually went up the week before July 4th. That's how my dad's vacation pattern worked out. And I couldn't convince my parents to stay. So I knew about the New York conventions for several years before I was able to attend one, which was incredibly frustrating. Finally, when I was doing the fanzine, almost as soon as we started, Phil Suling, who I had known a little bit, my dad had rented him his first store, his only store, his only time Phil foolishly went into retail, invited me to run what he called the fanzine table, which is I think what we met from.
Yes.
When you were doing your fanzine maybe a year later, probably. Phil would give you a couple of free tables if you would sell other people's fanzines with yours. So with that, as an argument, I was able to convince my folks to leave a week later, and I got to go to the 1971 New York convention, famous for being where Dennis Kitchen and Will Eisner met, and somehow I didn't.
Now, let's paint the picture for people who may not have been fortunate enough to go to that. Back then, the July 4th weekend city was the big show. Now, there were others, Detroit, the Triple Fest, and there were some out in California. But
Texas.
New York was it, because that's where the publishers were, that's where the bulk of the talent were.
It was the only show people would fly in to come to.
And it was part of the Statler Hilton Hotel for the most part, right?
In those years, for about 3 or 4 years, himself and Statler.
Right, and it was pretty much a dealer's room.
No,
programming.
There were panels. There was a luncheon every year at that point where the out-of-town guest of honor, who was at that point probably the only professional in America being flown to a comic convention at the convention's expense, would be interviewed by Phil, and people would eat. There was a costume parade, tiny. There was an auction. And Phil pretty much invented most of the model of what the conventions were, but there was a program book. The thing that's hardest to adjust to is that the New York Con was the largest comic convention in the world, and at that point the New York convention probably had, I think, in attendance of about 1,500 or 2,000 people.
Imagine that.
You know, we run bigger panels at the big shows now.
Now, Phil, after inviting you to do the fancy table and selling all of those for a piece of the action, he then invited you to do the program books for several years. So that must have been a challenge and an honor. Oh,
it was wonderful fun. I got to edit the New York Con program book for 3 years. One of them was the one that finally put in print Joe Simon's original design for Captain America. And so I got to meet all these incredible people through all of it. And then I also worked on the creation conventions, ran the dealer's room for those in the first couple of years in New York. So I did pretty much every aspect there was to do with a comic convention in its early years.
Yeah. For those unfamiliar, talk a little bit about Phil, the kind of guy he was and what he brought to comics.
If you're curious, probably I think one of the best pieces I ever wrote was my obit for Phil, which ran in Tales of the New Teen Titans number 50, if I remember right. He was a dreamer. I mean, Phil was a New York English teacher, high school English teacher. Loved comics, loved fantasy, you know, had dressed up in the early costume parades as Captain Marvel at the science fiction conventions. Had an enormous house full of comics and original art, and he was a big bear of a guy. His most famous ad was this wonderful one. You know, other dealers can offer you this or that, but can they offer you arrogance? And he really saw what the business could become. He invented the idea of comic shops buying direct in the days when the comic shops had to get the comics from newsstand dealers and could never find what they actually wanted. Ran the auctions himself, was a wonderful auctioneer. Teased the audience mercilessly. Found Hal Foster down in Florida, flew him up, found Will Eisner, and talked Will into actually showing up as a guest of honor at a convention. He connected all of this in an incredible way.
Cool. And through all of this, as you were doing more and more involved in New York fandom, which was really the engine for America fandom at the time, then you got an offer to join DC.
You know, I'm walking in the halls one day and Joe Orlando yells, "Hey, you, come in here." And, you know, I believe I was the first schmuck to walk by after Marv Wolfman gave up writing his letter columns. And he says, "You want to write my letter columns?" I said, "Yeah, I'm not a writer, Joe." And he said, "I read your fanzine, you write well enough to write a letter column." And suddenly I was a freelancer and a professional. Then Joe's assistant, Michael Fleischer, wanted to take the summer off to work on some other projects. And Joe said, you want to fill in? So I started on DC staff as an assistant editor on the masthead the day I graduated high school. Michael never came back. I did not kill him. He's had a wonderful and illustrious, very strange career working for strange UN projects in Africa, and went back and got his PhD and all sorts of humanities stuff. And I never left. Never managed to get honest work.
had Joe not offered you a staff position, did you have any ideas you were graduating high school what you might be doing next?
Well, I assumed that I would be able to get freelance work or staff work at DC and Marvel. At that point, I knew enough people, and I had to pay for college myself. And I had figured out, I think by the time I was 15, that I would be able to do that working for Marvel and DC if I stayed in New York. So I think I only applied to one college, NYU, because in those simpler days, if you had a reasonable academic record, and I certainly did, you had a reasonable chance of getting in where you wanted. But under the financial aid rules that existed in those days, the fact that my dad had paid off the house made us ineligible for financial aid. And they certainly didn't have the money to pay for me to go away to school. So NYU was the right solution because Columbia was just way too far to commute through the furthest reaches of Brooklyn. Got my revenge in teaching at Columbia these days. And actually mainly got my revenge because MIT is where I really wanted to go. And I should be teaching there next year.
Really?
They've been talking about doing a world building course up there, which would just be wonderful fun.
Oh, yeah.
But I figured I could pay for it that way. The comics were dying. This business was not going to be around.
I mean, one of the keynote speeches at these shows, might have been 72, 73, was Jim Warren, who declared comics would be dead in a few years. I mean,
well, if the comic shops had not come into being, if the direct sales market had not come into place, I've had the rare good fortune, perhaps uniquely among comic fans, to have more access to more data than probably anybody else. The newsstand version of the business would have disappeared entirely about 1983 or 1984. It's not to say the medium of comics would have died. It's a wonderful medium and would have found some way underground, some kinds of crazy independent publishing. But the commercial medium of it as a business would have disappeared by about that time. And mercifully, the shops came into being and managed to scrabble out an existence that enabled the field to have a second life.
Now, you were on staff as an assistant editor with Joe. At what point did you begin to think maybe you could write?
Well, when you start rewriting awful stuff and you say, oh, I could do that. So I started to learn enough to figure out how to get away with it.
And
not that my early stuff was much less awful, but we're dealing in incremental degrees here.
If I remember right, it's the Aquaman story in the back of Adventure?
That's the first superhero story, but a bunch of mystery stories before that.
So you were learning in shorter bites.
Yep.
Because that was the training ground in the 70s. You worked House of Mystery, House of Secrets, backups. Mm-hmm. And it was a great opportunity that is long since gone, which is a shame. But it almost exploded. You started doing Aquaman, and then all of a sudden you got Legion, and you were doing other stuff, and you were building up this nice little freelance side life. How did you juggle day and night?
Well, I didn't sleep. I hadn't discovered girls. I never was an athlete. Still not. You mean there's something other than work in life? I can get to do all this cool stuff. Not the healthiest approach. But for several years there just was so much cool stuff to do. I just didn't do anything but comics work. And
the volume of the writing you were doing, was that a good training ground to learn how to meet your deadlines as well as craft entertaining stories? Were there pitfalls in such volume?
Sure. The answer, most things are strengths or weakness. I mean, I've always been a very fast writer. I'm not a very meticulous writer. And at the beginning of my career, when I didn't have a lot of craft going for me yet, I wrote a bunch of stuff that I kind of shudder to look at. Somebody brought me a copy of the Teen Titans issue today that I think for about an hour I was supposed to take over Teen Titans.
This is the 70s incarnation, if I remember.
Yeah. And I plotted my first one. I think I may have dialogued a couple of pages, written a couple of pages of full script, and then some other bright and shiny assignment came along. It might have been Legion at that time, and suddenly Titans got left on the wayside, and Bob Rozakis ended up finishing up the issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure Bob did a much better job on it than I would have at that point in my career, but oh God.
Okay, then editing. You were working with Joe, who was doing a lot of the anthology works, trying to avoid the superhero books for as long as he could. What did you learn from him? I mean, because he is known as this amazing mentor to artists, but what about you from an editorial side?
Well, the most important thing he taught me is that the reader smells sincerity in the work, and that the reader would rather have a work that's sincere by somebody who doesn't know what they're doing than hack work by somebody who really does. And I have over the years come enormously to believe that. I learned a tremendous amount of craft. A quick story. So flash forward many years, I stepped back into DC's 9/11 project. Writers and artists respond or something like that. I forget what we entitled it. And Mo Willems, who's a brilliantly talented creator, animator, he's done Sheep in the Big City by that point, he's done some children's books, decides to do his first comic story for it. And it's a wonderful opportunity. Mo comes in with his first rough pencils, and I beat the crap out of him for a half hour, explaining comic book storytelling in all sorts of ways. And he's terrific. I mean, he's getting it all, and it's like, oh, that's why you do that? You know, he's fixing it, and ends up doing a wonderful job. He walks out of the office happily. And I sit back and I say, geez, I never could have done that when I was an editor years ago. This is what must have been what it felt like to be Joe Orlando. And then I say, holy shit, I'm the age Joe was when I was working for him. You know, some stuff, it just takes the years to learn.
And you were part of a generation of new, younger writers, artists, and editors coming into DC in the 70s there. So what was that like in the offices? Because you had all these generations suddenly working side by side.
Well, you had a bunch of older guys who were saying you shouldn't be paying attention to those sales to the comic shops and the fans because those aren't real. And, you know, there's a side at which they were right, because they were still writing for the young kids and the mass audience of that, and the information that was the comic shops was a very different and smaller audience. But they were utterly wrong, because that was the side of the market that was ultimately going to save us at that time. So that was a fascinating dichotomy. It was wonderful. You know, it was a bunch of young people, and we hung out together and went out to lunch together and played poker together and talked comics and how we were going to fix it and how we were going to change it, and shouldn't there be things like royalties, and we formed, you know, a not-for-profit organization or two to do all these things that would collapse 2 hours later because we were too young and too immature to have really figured out how to do all of these things. But there was all this energy to make things a better place. And that may be going on today, too, with 20-somethings in a very different way. You look at the energy that's coming out of places like Brooklyn with the webcomics and the indie publishing that's there. You walk around a place like Mocha Fest, or is it SPX or 8 that's here next week? And that's very much the same atmosphere. It's just they have tattoos now, and we didn't. But you know, in many ways, I think we represent almost the bookends of something. And there were guys a couple of years older than I am, Len, Marv. You come in pretty much the end of it, but I think between our time, pretty much any New York fan kid who really loved comics and cared about it at least got a chance to work in the business.
Right.
You got a seat, you got to sit down for a few minutes. If you actually had something to offer, whether it was creatively or with organizational skills or industry, you got to hang around. If you didn't, you didn't, but we almost all got a chance.
And also, you were there as the first generation was starting to stop working for the field. So you got to work with guys like Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, Jack Olek. So that must have been kind of cool. You know, guys whose work you had read and admired as a fan, suddenly working with them, buying stories or editing.
There's a wall of my apartment that's basically, you know, the wall of my friends looking down on me. And it's, you know, the cover that Jack did for the last issue of my fanzine, signed pieces by, you know, Jerry Siegel and Joe Kubert, and a ton of the great guys that I got to have relationships with. I missed a few, but Chaikin likes to use the line, we came in at the end of the beginning. Mm-hmm. And we got to meet almost all of them and really hear their stories from them, which is a wonderful thing.
Sure. And then there was this seismic shift. You come to work one day and you're told Carmine's no longer in charge. This young 29-year-old woman was going to take over.
28. Don't make her old before her time.
Excuse me. So what was that like to hear this kind of news?
For me, it was wonderful. You know, Carmine had noticed that I wasn't competent to write yet, and had kind of sent me back to the farm team as a writer. He was absolutely right, but didn't feel great at 19. And this was going to be fresh blood. This was going to be a young person. We never had a young person in a responsible job before. Never had a woman in a responsible job either. But that didn't occur to me quite the same way. And then Jeanette got there, and she was smart, and she was energetic, and she wanted to make things better, and she was questioning everything. And mostly, by her description, Bobby did a wonderful interview with her in back issue. You should look up if you haven't seen it. Someone was complimenting that today. Came over to the table and was talking to me about it. And by her description, I was the only person in the place who ever said no, and argued with her. And we began an extraordinarily fun, constructive partnership that lasted about 25 years of just examining things and picking things apart and looking at it from a very different points of view and making things better.
You guys actually work this amazing duo in an evolutionary sense, because it didn't happen day one, and your job role continued to change over the first couple of years. But Jeanette had all of this outside interest and energy, and yet you had all of the insider knowledge and almost, you were like the corporate history there. So you could give her the background of why things had been done one way, so you could examine why it should change. Were there other elements that made the synergy work well for you?
Yeah, I mean, my description always was that Jeanette's a non-linear thinker. Extraordinarily bright woman. But her mind naturally sort of goes A, B, Q. Q would be a good next letter. And I'm a much more linear structural thinker. I can get to Q, but I don't naturally leap to Q. And she'd make these leaps and have no clue how to get to Q. But she'd be convinced that Q was a good place to go. So can we figure out a way to do that? And I'd go pick it apart and figure out how to build a bridge to get to Q, or figure out, and this is where the no came in, Q's not a good idea because the bridge is going to collapse somewhere around L. Or we just can't manage Q yet this year. It was wonderful fun. She's also a wonderful writer, but a very, very slow writer. So very often in terms of corporate documents or things that we'd be using to create arguments for things or presentations or stuff, I'd be able to do a really fast, great first draft. As I said, I'm a fast writer, not a meticulous one. She's a meticulous but slow one. And then she'd take a whack at it and start editing it and polish stuff. And we work really well together that way too.
And one of the things that you said you talked about earlier with the other generation of editors and talent was the idea of things like royalties and better working conditions. And she showed up 76, and then you guys, it took about 6 years before royalties became a reality. So was that a goal from the beginning?
Jeanette's philosophical goal from day one was to treat talent better because that made things better. You know, we were living in comics at a point that I think fulfilled the old Russian joke of they pretend to pay us so we pretend to work. don't get me wrong, we love being in comics, but everybody felt underpaid. Everybody felt they had to be working on whatever their next thing was. And there was a lot of frustration from all of it. And I don't think it certainly was not that the companies were making zillions of dollars off the creative people's work, because the companies were not doing particularly well in those years. But it had not occurred to the people running the businesses of the comic book companies that if you align the interests of the creative people with the publishing company, you'll get a better result. That was a radical leap, and that was a natural leap for Jeanette to make. She was able very quickly to get through the concept that people creating new characters should get some equity in the non-comics profitability of those characters, because that sort of was selling the corporation. We haven't made any money from this ever, so if somebody creates a new thing that maybe someday will make any money, it doesn't cost us anything to give them a share of that. So that was viable. But it took us a bunch of years to figure out the business model of how we could justify paying royalties on the publishing program that really wasn't making very much money. And that came as a part of a whole effort to make the publishing business reasonably profitable again.
Okay, I'm going to step back just a moment and talk about the editorial side of your life, because you were one of the youngest people ever to work in comics to be credited as editor. With the
Stan beat me, damn him.
But Christmas Superheroes tabloid was your first editorial assignment? But then you went to original material pretty soon after. And it sort of culminated in inheriting the bad titles from Julie. So that must have been an interesting moment.
It was fascinating. This was during the implosion, and we had to juggle all the pieces around. And Julie being Julie, and having earned it on about 1,000 levels, had his choice of whether he would keep Superman or Batman. And he really liked Batman better, but Superman was still the prestige character in the house. This was the time of the Superman movie. The Superman books still made more money. So he decided to keep Superman. So I got Batman as sort of the next guy down on the food chain. And I love doing Batman. I got to work with some great talent. I've always regretted Julie's choice, though, because I think he would have done a better job on the Batman titles, and I would have done a better job on the Superman ones. But
okay, and additionally as an editor, especially on the House of Mystery, you got to work with that next generation that followed you of writers and artists, particularly guys like Mark DeMatteis. What were you looking for talent?
God. Desperately looking for guys who hadn't written 4,000 mystery stories and hadn't run out of ideas.
Okay.
More than anything else. Mark was my best slush pile find. The guy who's gone on to the best career in comics, who had never sold anything before. He would have sold to somebody else 2 minutes later, I'm sure. If not, but I still got to be proud. But I worked with an army of new writers, some of whom went on to write cool stuff in other media.
Okay. And then all of a sudden it's 1980. Dick is hired. He gets the Batman books. You give up the Batman books to Dick, House of Mystery to Karen. All of a sudden, your editorial life kind of ended and you became manager of business affairs. But looking back, would you say there were any regrets you had as an editor, things you wish you had a chance to do, or things you should have done differently?
Well, you know, there's always a batting average. In any job I've ever had. Mark Evanier, a couple of times in writing about me, has used a line that goes something like, you know, overall I really like what my friend Paul has done, even though I don't agree with all of his decisions. And I'm always tempted to answer that with, Mark, I don't agree with all of my decisions. You know, you make decisions and they're the best ones you can make that day. When you're an editor or when you're a publisher, you make a ton of decisions and you make them either based on imperfect information or you make them based on circumstances as they are that day. You know, I've got to get this book closed by a certain deadline. Who do I know who's available? Who do I think might be available? What choice can I make? And we all have a batting average in the process. I wish my batting average on all of my jobs had been better, but I'm not embarrassed by what it was in any of them.
And then on the business side, there you were working with Jeanette, and by the mid-'80s, as we got to the 50th anniversary of the company and the crisis and what came after, it was like all the pieces had been put into place to allow this incredible explosion of creativity. So that as...
At the end of the day, it's the royalties. That's the thing that changes the comic book business is the realization that talent deserves and requires a piece of the action to benefit from their own success. They have to have a reason to bet on themselves. The industry, in one form or another, moves to a royalty model at the beginning of the 80s. And it really only takes 2 or 3 years for the explosion of creativity to start happening. And whether it's the model that we used, or I think I saw Mike sneaking in the back somewhere, who was the first editor, and from the talent standpoint, I'd argue certainly the driving force at First Comics. The model that they used, or the model that Pacific Comics used, the model at Marvel Institute, a model based on ours once we put ours in place to compete effectively. It cost them a lot more than it cost us, so that was an important move and a difficult move for them. But that's the deciding point. That's what changes the rules. There's nuances to having the copyright or the trademark in their name, or this right or that right in a contract, but the black and white stark dividing line is, do the guys have a stake in their own work?
Okay. As you worked on the business side of the company, eventually becoming president and then president and publisher, what are the highlights? What are the things you brought to the company or to the field that you can look back on with pride?
I got to do so much cool stuff, and I really don't divide it by what job I was in. The accomplishments are of the management team of the company. Jeanette, Joe, Dick, and many other people. Mike for the few years that we had him in the marketing and public relations side of the company. Other people who were in and through. What I look back on proudly, I wrote the first standard written contract for talent in this business, getting us off the back of the check to a contract that guaranteed whatever the publisher was saying, whether that was you'll get your artwork back, company was returning it, but you now have a contractual right to it that sort of took the relationship up to a mature and professional level. I wrote the first royalty plan for the business, figured out how to make the economics of that work. There had been royalties in comics going back to the 1940s for the occasional star talent, but this was the first time everybody who worked for a company had a chance to make royalties if their work succeeded. A lot of the work with the distribution system and direct that really fundamentally built the comic shops. Similarly, a lot of work saving it from collapse in the mid-1990s when Marvel did the Heroes World mistake. A lot of work on building the systems that ultimately enabled the graphic novel to emerge. I failed a couple of times. I'd always believed that it was important for the great works to be available. You went into a bookstore, you could get Agatha Christie, not just John Grisham. Comics didn't have that going for it. So I did a couple of test structures that I thought might work in the late 70s and the early 80s that were complete failures of structure. And then in the mid-80s, we developed the trade paperback graphic novel. There had been some published before, never by a comic book publisher, never with an intent to create imprint works that would be a perpetual library of material the way the book publishing industry used it. And that became really the dominant model for the industry for many, many years to come. I got to have such great fun.
And now you're into a whole other chapter of your life as both writer and teacher. What's it like going back to the keyboard on a full-time basis?
I wish I was better. It's been great that I've been let back on the field and haven't been booed off as, getting back to the Old Timers Day game. And thank you all for your support. So many of you who stopped by and talked to me. And it's great when I see young people who are reading, particularly World's Finest. That's been a great thrill to see a lot of young women enjoying that title. It's different. It's a very different field than it was when I was quote-unquote a major writer in it in the 1980s. I wish I was more of a major writer now. I'd like to get better at it. We'll see if I can find that within myself over time. The teaching is enormous fun. We launched Columbia's first course in the American graphic novel this term, and they were originally figuring we'd get about 25, maybe if we were lucky 30 people. We had 60 people in the classroom the first day in a classroom designed for 40, literally SRO, and people sitting on the floor. We're now up to 75 for it. It's just a hoot and a half.
Now you're teaching in a couple of different venues right now, right? Columbia, Manhattanville still?
Teaching at Manhattan, writing for the media at Manhattanville for the last couple of years, do a couple of sections of that. Pace has a master's in publishing program. I teach comics and graphic novel publishing process there, and then the graphic novel course at Columbia. I've taught transmedia at Columbia as well. Still finding places that are willing to put up with me.
And you stand up and you're talking to people. You're used to that from conventions and all. Is it any different in a classroom setting?
Sure. I mean, I'm not a great teacher yet. I'm learning. I'm co-teaching the graphic novel course at Columbia with a friend of mine who's a professor of Yiddish as his day job, but is an enormous comic fan and has done he's taught other things. And I watched Jeremy at work, and he's a real teacher. He knows all this stuff that I don't know about how to work this stuff. And I'm learning on the job. And is this something you see doing long term? I hope so. My long term isn't as long as my long term once was. But teaching provides really, for me, a very powerful balance because it gets me out of the house, gets me working with young people. I love the office environment at DC. We had such fun there for so many years. Now, you're writing World's Finest and Legion, which is interesting because they're both on the fringes of what the New 52 is all about. Does that make it easier or tougher for you? I've usually stayed on the fringes as a writer. I mean, I wrote, most of my stuff was either in the future, on Earth-2, right, the old Earth-2, not the new Earth-2, Phantom Stranger. I mean, the continuity writing is lovely. It's just really hard work to be one of like 4 Superman writers at any given moment. On top of writing a good story, you've got to coordinate everything with everyone, and that's just never been my first priority. I like how in the zero-issue World's Finest that came out on Wednesday, that Earth-2 Supergirl was being trained as the secret weapon, going all the way back to the original Mort concept. That's your idea? Something to help set her apart from the other Supergirl? In the I think that was my line. That's what I grew up on. So I channel some of that. But I love the bits and pieces, whether it's in World's Finest or Legion, that relate back. And I love being able to find the new thing that you could never do before. That World's Finest zero issue, the line I have in that where Robin introduced herself with a reference to Robin Hood. I don't think anybody's ever done that. And clearly that's what was in their minds when, I'm not going to get into the debate between maybe the last guy who was a friend to Bill, Jerry, and Bob, so I'm not going to get into the argument between them about who created what. But whichever one of their minds was at work that day, none of them thought to use that line. Sure. And that's kind of a natural. It's cool to be able to add something to a legend after 70-odd years that was clearly always there. Now, having just done a Legion Origin mini-series, what can we look forward to in Legion Zero, which is supposed to be some sort of origin story? Well, it's an unrevealed piece. It focuses on Brainiac. It's called Brainiac's Original Sin, and it is. And you have to read the story to find out which sin it was. Okay, now I see that you're starting to also branch out into more book writing. You just did that, huge honkin', 75th anniversary book for Tashin. But now I see you're doing something about Will for Abrams' books. You want to talk about that? Am I yet, Charlie? We're this close. And we're this close. And Mr. Kotzman over there was kind enough to ask me if I would do a book on Will Eisner for Abrams and his beautiful line there. And I am dearly hoping to do a book called Will Eisner, the Dreamer and the Dream, the Birth of the American Graphic Novel. which you might see as curiously relating to what I'm teaching.
Clever. What other kind of book projects might you be interested in doing?
Well, I'm interested in a lot of different things. Whether I ever get off my ass and get them done is another interesting question. Those of you who are not teachers may not know this, but technically speaking, 3 or 4 college courses is theoretically a full-time job teaching college. And my contract calls me to write 3 comics a month for DC, which is pretty much a full-time job writing comics. And I'm doing some of this book stuff. So, and hoping there'll be a little bit of a life somewhere in the middle of all of this too. Okay.
We're starting to run out of time, so I just want to also touch on, you're doing something for CBLDF, or the HERO initiative for Roger Slifer. You want to talk about that?
Not actually doing anything for Roger. I mean, I'm on the board of the CBLDF, which is a great organization. Please donate, please support. It's very important for our field. HERO has been working very actively in behalf of a dear old friend of mine named Roger Slifer, who was an editor at Marvel, editor at DC at one point, DC's first direct sales manager, and was the co-creator of Lobo. Roger, unfortunately, was hit and run about 8 weeks ago in California, and has been in a coma since, and probably will never have a human life again, or a fully realized human life again. He's got a long, long battle ahead of him. He's given a lot to this industry, and a check to HERO for their indicating that it's in support of Roger Slifer would be a lovely gesture from anyone who can. $10, it's fine. $10,000 is even fine. But the bottom line for these organizations, CBLDF really on a daily basis is out there keeping comics from being thrown out of libraries, keeping customs in Canada from locking up a guy for having manga on his laptop. And we're not talking about horrible things. We're talking about things that just trigger somebody's imagination, and someone gets caught up in it. HERO reaches out and helps the writers and artists who've given us so much pleasure, who in many cases didn't make a great living in the first place, and one way or another have had challenges in their life. And these are great causes.
All right, I got the sign. We are out of time. Paul's down at the tables in the dealer's room. He'll be around all weekend. Thank you for your time and your patience.
And thank you for letting me avoid on this work.